But Rachel Morales remained beneath the gentle glow of a roadside diner, where coffee is poured steadily and gratitude doesn't need to be spoken. Each morning, a cup of coffee still waits for her on the counter. No one claims to have made it, and no one needs to ask. One day, a little boy was carried into the diner by his father. Embroidered on the boy's shirt were the words, Tommy Morales, middle name of courage. We named him after you, because we wanted him to grow up with a name that means survival and kindness. More than a symbol, Rachel had become a living legacy. What would you do if a waitress with horrifying scars approached your table with a gentle smile and a steaming cup of coffee? Would you look her in the eyes, or would you choose to look away? That morning, a group of customers walked into a roadside diner in El Paso, Texas, and within minutes, they made the whole room fall silent. One cruel remark, one scarred face, one past never spoken aloud, and then, less than 24 hours later, dozens of U.S. Marines stood in line outside the same diner at sunrise, each carrying a small gift wrapped in cloth. Who were they there for? And what could have moved these battle-hardened men, who had stared death in the face, to bow their heads before a waitress? Rachel Morales, 35, worked the morning shift at a small diner just off Interstate 10, near what used to be a Marine Corps base in El Paso. She arrived earlier than the sun, 5 a.m. sharp, already wearing a worn-out apron, her hands well-trained from years of service. Her black hair was tied neatly back, exposing a series of scars that ran from her right temple, down her neck, and disappeared beneath her simple uniform collar. Along her right arm, more scars reappeared, as if her skin itself was telling a story no one dared to ask about. The regulars had grown used to Rachel's quiet presence. She didn't speak much, but the coffee was always hot, the orders always right, and the checks never mixed up. Still, strangers often couldn't hide their hesitation. Truck drivers sometimes glanced her way. Elderly couples gave her a quick look, then retreated behind their newspapers. Some whispered when they thought she couldn't hear, maybe a car crash or a fire or drugs. None of it was new to Rachel. She never replied. She just poured the coffee, served the plates, and collected her tips with the calm of someone who had long since made peace with judgment. But on one Tuesday morning, the silence was shattered. 3 sharply dressed men in business suits walked in, likely en route to Albuquerque, and sat at a corner table, their loud voices breaking the stillness. When Rachel came over with the menus, one of them, the ringleader, looked up at her, his eyes dripping with contempt. "You think you should be serving people with a face like that?" he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe the kitchen would be more your place." No one spoke. An elderly man eating soup quietly set down his spoon and looked away. The cook behind the counter paused in the middle of flipping an egg. Rachel, she didn't flinch. She didn't lash out or tremble. She simply placed the menu gently on the table, poured the coffee like always, and said softly, "I used to serve men like you, but in places far harsher than this." That single sentence, seemingly soft-spoken, set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. The next day, people saw a long line of veterans and young Marines outside the diner, not there for breakfast, but to say thank you. And it was only then that people truly began to see Rachel's scars, not as flaws, but as symbols. Symbols of courage, sacrifice, and a quiet dignity that could never be erased. That morning began like any other. The regulars left quietly after their first cup of coffee. A few truckers dropped cash beside their half-eaten plates of eggs, and Rachel Morales kept her steady pace, hands moving with practiced ease. But at 7:15 a.m., the air inside the diner began to shift. 3 sharply dressed men, white shirts, loosened ties, gleaming watches walked in with a confidence tinged by arrogance. They weren't regulars, likely businessmen passing through El Paso on their way to a morning meeting in Albuquerque. Their laughter echoed through the otherwise calm space. They took over the back corner booth, a spot usually left for older veterans, and launched into loud conversations about quarterly revenue, golf courses, and their upcoming getaway in Scottsdale. Rachel approached them with 3 menus, her polite smile intact. But as she leaned down to place the menus on the table, the man in the middle locked eyes with her. His gaze tightened. Then his lips curled into a mocking grin. "You seriously think you should be working as a waitress with a face like that?" he said, loud, deliberate, for the whole diner to hear. "Pretty sure you'd be better off in the dish pit." The room froze. An older man sitting at the counter set his spoon down and quietly turned away. The cook behind the grill stopped mid-motion, spatula suspended in the air. The laughter at the corner booth continued, sharp, grating, mean. Rachel didn't answer right away. Her chest tightened for a moment, not because of the words, but because of the cold familiarity in them. She'd heard every variation of that same judgment for years after her discharge at job interviews, gas stations, even while walking into grocery stores. But something about this moment made silence impossible. "I used to serve men like you," she replied, voice low but steady, "but in places where the gunfire was louder than your judgment." The man faltered slightly. His two friends stifled their laughter. But no one else in the diner was laughing. One trucker stood up, dropped some bills on the table, and walked out, leaving his breakfast untouched. Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she poured coffee at the next table, but her eyes didn't waver. She met each customer's gaze one by one, not with defiance, but with quiet strength, as if to say, "I'm still here. I'm still me." Eleanor, the diner's owner, a woman in her 60s with wise, watchful eyes, approached Rachel and gently touched her shoulder. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly, voice laced with concern and anger. "I'm fine," Rachel said, trying to organize a stack of silverware on her tray. "Compared to Fallujah, this is nothing." Eleanor gave her hand a firm, reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to serve them. I will." Rachel shook her head. "It's all right, ma'am. Some people are just afraid of what they don't understand." And then she returned to work quietly, calmly, but no longer invisible. Because even when looked down on, Rachel Morales was never small. She simply chose to stand her ground without raising her voice. Customers who came into the little diner in El Paso saw only a woman with a scarred face and quiet eyes. They saw a hard-working waitress, punctual, polite, never complaining. But what they didn't see was the reason behind the scars. The battles Rachel Morales carried silently in her mind each day, and a military past once radiant then shattered like glass under unbearable pressure. Rachel once served as a logistics specialist and combat medic with Bravo Company 19 United States Marine Corps, stationed in the Helmand province of Afghanistan. Her duties went far beyond tracking supplies or managing inventory. On the front lines, Rachel became the first pair of hands to wrap wounds, while medevac helicopters were still minutes away, the last voice to calm a dying soldier amidst gunfire and swirling dust. One afternoon in September 2012, while completing an inventory report near a supply truck, her unit came under mortar fire. Instead of running for shelter as ordered, Rachel sprinted toward a Humvee that had just taken a direct hit. Two young Marines were trapped inside, one bleeding heavily, the other screaming in panic. She pulled them both from the burning wreck, just seconds before a second round exploded. The blast threw her violently. The entire right side of her body suffered third-degree burns. Her ribs cracked. Her eardrum burst. She lost hearing in her right ear, and the scars that overtook one side of her face would never fade. Rachel woke up in a military hospital in Ramstein, Germany. After 8 months of treatment, doctors declared her medically unfit for duty, both physically and mentally. With her medical discharge came a Purple Heart, a few lines citing extraordinary acts of valor and a future she had never prepared for, civilian life. She returned to the U.S. with a decorated file. But in job interviews, no one saw Bravo 19 before they saw her scars. Polite rejections followed. "We're looking for someone more customer-facing. Sorry, we're trying to match a certain brand image." Rachel became quieter, more withdrawn. And when she walked into a small roadside diner called Sunrise Grill, all she hoped for was a life at peace. The owner, Eleanor Hartman, a woman in her 60s, had once sent a son to Fallujah. She knew exactly how the world tended to look at people who came back altered. Eleanor looked Rachel over once, didn't ask about the scars, didn't request a resume. She simply said, "Can you start tomorrow, sweetheart?" Eleanor didn't need an explanation. She had seen that same look in her son's eyes, a weariness beyond words, a hardened clarity only possessed by those who'd heard bullets scream past their ears. That's why she gave Rachel a chance. And from that day on, in the modest little space where strangers cross paths on long journeys, Rachel Morales found a quiet place to land, even though her battles never truly ended. They had only taken on a different form, quieter, deeper, to endure, to serve, despite how the world chose to see her. The next morning, Rachel Morales arrived at the diner at 5:15 a.m. Just like always, her steps steady, a cup of hot coffee in hand. But as she reached for the door lock, she froze. Across the street, beneath the faint glow of a street lamp, stood a silent line of people. They didn't speak. They barely moved. They just stood there orderly, still like a formation long drilled into muscle memory. They weren't in uniform, but Rachel recognized them instantly. Marines. When she finally opened the door, the first to walk in was a tall man with graying hair and the eyes of someone who had seen war. He took a seat at the counter and gave her a quiet nod. "Black coffee," he said. Then, in a lower voice, "You probably don't remember me, Morales, but I never forgot you." Rachel hesitated. There was something familiar in his voice and in the faint scar along his wrist. "Captain Halston?" she nearly gasped. "That's me. Retired now," he said with a gentle smile. "But I'm not here to talk about retirement. I'm here to repay an old debt from that supply truck in Helmand. Remember?" Rachel's hand trembled as she poured his coffee. A long-locked memory came rushing back, fire, screams, the acrid sting of smoke and blood. She had dragged him from a burning Humvee while rounds still cracked overhead. "In those 5 seconds," he said, "you changed 12 lives. We all made it home, and we've been trying to find you ever since." It was true. They had been looking for her, but no one knew where Rachel had gone after she quietly left military life behind. Not until the day before, when a truck driver, disturbed by how she'd been humiliated by a group of businessmen, had uploaded a short clip online with a caption that read, "They mocked the woman with scars. Tomorrow she'll make the whole nation bow its head." The video spread like wildfire. On a veterans forum, a young Marine named PFC, Carter, who had served with Bravo 19, watched in stunned silence. Not just because of the scars, but because of her voice, the same calm, steady voice that had once reassured him while she treated his wounds on a battlefield 10 years earlier. He immediately posted an old photo of Rachel from the war zone and wrote, "That's Morales. She saved my captain. I've never forgotten that face, even when it was covered in blood and ash." From there, former members of Bravo, 19, and others she had saved began reconnecting. They shared news, tracked each other down, and then they descended on El Paso. No big announcements, no headlines, just a silent promise fulfilled to say something they had owed her for over a decade. "Thank you. You saved us." The sight of a long line of veterans standing silently outside a small diner in El Paso could not be ignored. The first person to capture the moment, the same truck driver who had filmed Rachel being mocked the day before, had only intended to post it on his page with a simple caption, "This is how those she saved chose to respond." But he didn't expect the video to go viral, spreading far beyond his control in just 12 hours. It was shared across veteran groups, military forums, then picked up by local news sites, and finally, national television networks. Every comment, every share carried the same emotion, reverence and gratitude. Under one post that had gathered over 1 million views, a man wrote, "I'm alive because she held my hand until the chopper arrived. I owe her my life but never knew where she was until this morning." From a quiet early morning diner, Sunrise Grill became a destination. People drove hours from nearby towns, not to eat, but simply to place a hand on the counter where Rachel worked, to leave a commemorative coin, or just to say, "Thank you for what you did, and for people like you, we still have hope." Local reporters arrived first, followed by state news crews. Cameras focused on the humble restaurant, and on the woman who always bowed her head when asked questions, but whose eyes never flinched. When offered an interview, Rachel simply smiled gently and told the owner, "Eleanor, I didn't do it to be known. I just didn't want the people I saved to be forgotten." Eleanor, a mother who knew what loss looked like, placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder and whispered, "And that's why you'll be remembered more than anyone else." That very week, 3 local businesses announced new hiring policies specifically for veterans with visible injuries. A nonprofit healthcare foundation proposed a new scholarship, the Morales Courage Grant for discharged soldiers pursuing careers in medicine. The El Paso City Council held an emergency session, and just 2 days later, They unanimously voted to rename the street in front of the diner, Morales Way. Rachel didn't speak much about any of it. She still arrived at 5:15 a.m., still poured that first cup of coffee for the first customer. But now, a cup of coffee made just the way she liked it always sat waiting for her on the counter. No note, no explanation, no one claimed to have made it. It was just a silent thank you from a community that once turned its back and now chose to bow its head. A week after the video went viral, as the news cycle began to fade and social media quieted down, a handwritten letter arrived at Sunrise Grill. On the envelope, in firm lettering, it read, "Invitation, Rachel Morales Private Bravo 19 Honor Ceremony." The sender was Captain Halston, now retired. Inside, he wrote that the surviving members of Bravo 19, along with the families of those who hadn't made it home, wanted to hold a small, private ceremony to honor the woman they had long called by one name, Angel in the Fire. Rachel hadn't planned to attend. She'd never been comfortable revisiting the past, and even less so when attention was involved. She didn't see what she'd done as heroism, just duty. But Eleanor, with her quiet wisdom, gently placed a hand over Rachel's and said, "Sometimes it's not about wanting recognition. It's about giving others a chance to say thank you fully and finally." The ceremony was held at the VFW Hall, 3 blocks from the diner. That evening, Rachel arrived wearing a simple black dress. Her hair, usually tightly tied, now hung softly around her shoulders, and for the first time, she let her scars show. When the doors opened, 200 people inside stood up. There was no applause, no cheering, only the soft clink of metal touching wood unit coins, one by one, gently tapped on tabletops. A solemn military tradition for those considered living legends. Rachel walked slowly between the rows. Her eyes met each nod, each tear, each grateful glance. On the small stage, Captain Halston stood waiting, holding a wooden frame encased in glass. Inside, the Bravo 19 unit patch and the Purple Heart Rachel had never accepted. "When you were discharged, we lost track of you," he said, voice trembling. "Some thought you hadn't made it. Some thought you chose to disappear. But we never forgot, Morales. We searched for you for 7 years. Not because you were a medal, but because you're the reason we're still here." Rachel took the box in her hands, her eyes moist, not from the medal, but because at last, the scattered fragments of memory had found their place. Inside the frame was also a photo, worn and dusty from war. Rachel, in her field gear, hands bloodied and bandaged, carrying a young soldier away from the flames. She touched the glass gently, then said in a soft, clear voice, "I never thought I deserved these, and maybe that's exactly why I have to accept them." End all. The entire hall stood still in a sacred hush, until the rhythmic clinking of coins resumed, one after another, echoing through the room with reverence. No one stepped up to give grand speeches, because the greatness of Rachel Morales had never needed a microphone. There were no parades, no banners, and no loud campaigns. But ever since the honor ceremony for Rachel Morales at the VFW Hall, a quiet wave of change began to ripple through the El Paso community, not like a storm, but like a steady underground current, persistent, enduring, and real. The next morning, when Rachel arrived at the diner as usual, her familiar cup of coffee was already waiting at the counter, brewed just right at just the right time. But this time, there was a small new detail. A wooden plaque hung beside the register, engraved with the words, "Here, every scarce seen or unseen is honored." Those words didn't stay within the 4 walls of Sunrise Grill for long. A barbershop on Main Street put up a new sign, 50% off for all veterans because a scar doesn't define you, but it tells the story of what you've survived. At the local high school, where many students were children of service members, the guidance office proudly displayed Rachel's quote on its front board. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's stepping forward despite knowing the risk." Even a nearby VA clinic redecorated its waiting room with images from the honor ceremony, not of Rachel, but of the veterans she once saved, now living new lives. On the wall, in bold gold lettering, it read, "We survived because someone refused to give up." Most notably, the El Paso City Council, usually cautious about renaming streets, unanimously approved changing the stretch of road where Sunrise Grill stood. It would now be called Morales Way. No grand speeches, Just a simple ceremony on Veterans Day. When the mayor invited Rachel to speak, she stood, smiled gently, and said, "Thank you to all who've ever worn the uniform. Our scars may look different, but we all carry them. And we keep living for those who couldn't." The impact didn't stop in El Paso. Rachel's story was selected for inclusion in the Marine Corps recruit training materials as a living example of the core values of honor, courage, and commitment. In medical training sessions for veterans, the combat first aid lesson now always begins with a story. This is why you learn to stay calm, because someone like Rachel Morales once kept an entire team alive with bare hands and unshakable belief. And every Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, the corner booth at Sunrise Grill fills with young Marines from the nearby base. Rachel serves them like she does every other customer, but there's a look in her eyes, a quiet watchfulness, as if to say, "I was once in your boots, and if one day you carry scars too, don't hide them. Live in a way that makes them proof of something right." Time moved on. The viral video eventually faded from headlines and timelines. Not because of medals, but because she chose to keep serving. No longer in combat, but in everyday life, where quiet kindness often echoes the loudest. And perhaps the greatest lesson Rachel Morales left behind wasn't about the scars, but about how she chose to see them, not as marks of pain, but as a map of all the places she didn't turn away. She once said, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting even when your heart is trembling." If this story touched you, leave us a comment below. Who is the Rachel Morales in your life? Tap like if you believe scars can be a sign of strength. Subscribe for more real life stories where scars aren't hidden, but cherished like unspoken medals.